updates with Mr. Warford. Updates with Mr. Warford. Updates with Mr. Warford. Updates with Mr. Warford.
What's up? Welcome to Updates with Mr. Warford. This is from our world history people. We're talking about World War I. All right, we've already talked about the causes. Now we're going to get into how World War I was a new type of war. And in this slideshow that's available in Google Classroom, there's also some links to like videos and websites that'll give you a little more background, interesting background information. I'm just giving us the highlights, okay? So in World War I, we see all kinds of new technology and all kinds of new tactics that are going to make the Great War what it was referred to then. Now we call it World War I. What was going to make it the most unique and how it was going to change warfare forever. Okay, so again, today we're looking at what was developed and used during World War I that changed warfare for the rest of world history into a more modern era. The first thing was trench warfare. Okay, trenches had been used in war before, but World War I was predominantly fought in trenches. Okay, armies fought in these long, narrow ditches. The area between enemy trenches was called no man's land, and charges were organized and soldiers were ordered to go over the top into open ground to fight. And because of new access to like new weapons and new technology, casualties mounted up very quickly, and there were huge amounts of casualties. Battles resulted in many deaths for very small gain. There wasn't a lot of territory that was gained in World War I. There was a lot of stalemates, people in trenches shooting artillery shells at each other. Life in trenches was very difficult and very unsanitary. You're sleeping in the dirt, basically in a hole. Water would accumulate, because of bad weather and lead to things like trench foot, which is damage to the skin on your feet, but from exposure to wet conditions. There's rats in there. And obviously, you're being bombarded with bombs constantly. So here's some pictures of what trench life was like in World War I. You see, water and, huddling here to keep yourself safe from bombardment. So here's a video about going over the top that I've attached in Google Classroom. Talks about the horror of having to run across that open expanse and try to jump into the enemy trench. So here's a quote. "When things quieted, I went and looked at a German I knew I had shot, and I remembered thinking that he looked old enough to have a family, and I felt very sorry. We were just meant to be sacrificed as we ran into a wall of steel. A chap had the bottom of his jaw blown off and still kept going forward until he dropped." So trench warfare and going over the top to try to across no man's land, very intense, very deadly. So what's some new technology that we see in World War I that's going to change warfare forever? One is the machine gun. Okay, first invented in 1844 in the United States, World War I is the first war where we see extensive use of a machine gun by all sides in the war. One team of soldiers could now shoot about 450 to 600 rounds a minute. To put it into perspective, at the beginning of the war, horses were used throughout World War I, but at the beginning of the war, people were still trying to ride horses into battle at the beginning of the war. So imagine being able to have a machine gun at your disposal. That quickly became obsolete, okay? People did not ride horses any longer into battle after World War I because it was basically a death wish. The second thing, tanks, okay? The British developed the first tanks in response to trench warfare. They thought, well, if we can't run over the top and jump in their trench before we get shot, let's create some kind of machine that we can drive into that open land and then get into their trench. Tanks had some tech issues in World War I because they were so new, but as we know, if you know anything about military history or the military in general, they're going to become a huge deal in later wars that are fought in world history. It was basically an armored vehicle that had chain tracks instead of wheels. Airplanes and Zeppelins. World War I was the first war where airplanes were used. Opposing armies would drop bombs out of them and fire machine guns from them. And obviously they will be used later in warfare. Zeppelins were these large hydrogen-filled airships, and they were used for surveillance as well as bombing raids. We don't see Zeppelins used in war. They've kind of become obsolete in warfare after World War One, but airplanes definitely are going to continue to have a legacy in warfare. Submarines were introduced by the Germans during World War One, called U-boats. They could launch torpedoes or underwater missiles at enemy ships, and the German use of U-boats or submarines is actually what's going to get the U.S. involved in World War One, which we'll talk about at a later date. The Germans were deadly with the use of submarines or U-boats. And then finally, poisonous gas. Okay, Germans introduced chlorine gas in 1915. It caused blindness, burns, suffocation, torn lungs, vomiting, and often death. Because it was the first time it was used on a mass scale in war, there were some glitches to figure out, such as wind direction. So sometimes they would blow poisonous gas into the air in hopes that it would travel into the enemy trench and it would actually blow back on them if the wind changed and kill or maim, blind people, their own soldiers or themselves. So here we see pictures of gas masks were used. That's another tech innovation. Here's an unfortunate man that did not have a gas mask. You can see him grasping for his throat. Here's men that have been blinded by poisonous gas. So poisonous gas was definitely feared by your average soldier in World War One. Here's a poem by a former World War One soldier, a World War One veteran. You can see dim green or thick green light as under a sea of under a green sea, I saw him drowning. So this is a very vivid description of a man, a soldier seeing a fellow soldier, grasping for his neck as he loses air because he doesn't have his gas mask on or wasn't able to get it. So very intense. Shell shock. So in previous wars in world history, what's now known as post-traumatic stress disorder existed and affected soldiers. In the Civil War, it was referred to as soldier's heart. Sometimes people just casted it off as like, if somebody has what we now know as PTSD, they just, didn't have the courage to fight. They didn't have the heart for it. Now we know that that's inaccurate, not true, but there was not a lot understood about it. In World War One, there becomes what's known as shell shock, okay, and what we now know as PTSD. Shrapnel from mortars, grenades, and artillery shells accounted for about 60% of the deaths of World War One. So of about 9 or a little over 9 million people that died, 60% of what happened was because of bombs and artillery shells going into trenches. So symptoms of shell shock, these mental consequences of constantly being afraid of being blown up, essentially, were trembling, rigid limbs, loss of speech, dizziness, confusion, disorder of your sleep, having nightmares. Not much was understood about it, but a lot of people suffered from this in World War One. Treatments ranged from resting in a hospital, getting them off the front line, sending them home, to hypnosis, all the way to electric shock therapy. They would hook you up to electrodes and shock you in hopes that it would change some kind of thing in your brain. So not a lot was known about shell shock, but it was something that was documented more and more during World War One. Here's a quote from a veteran. What we felt, we'd rather lose a leg, be wounded, anything but to have shell shock. We were all afraid of shell shock. It hit the nerves, and the fellows that had come out, they never really recovered in mind, a lot of them. We dreaded that. We didn't mind being wounded. It was the dread of being shell shocked. And within this slideshow, I have some other quotes and links to sites to learn more about that. Also a video that shows you just what the fear was like and what it was like to be in a trench like this guy and to fight through that. Very extreme conditions. So what I want you to do with the next 3 days is I want you to complete the weapons and tech of World War I assignment, and then we're going to move on to major events of the war. As always, I appreciate y'all. Have a great day. If you have any questions, let me know.